7 verses 1 through 12 is the passage we'll be in today. Genesis 47 verses 1 through 12. We've been focused on the life of Joseph for so long that it would be easy to forget that we'd spent a lot of time on the life of Jacob before we got to Joseph. Remember, he was the man who ran away from his twin brother because Esau wanted to kill him after he had bought the birthright from Esau and then cheated Esau of the blessing. Then he had all kinds of trouble with his father-in-law and had to work for his wife, and then found out that he married her sister instead, so he had to work another few years to marry her as well, and then, of course, the wives didn't get along. There's all kinds of drama in the life of Jacob. But then we had kind of switched from Jacob's life to the life of his sons and his daughter. We looked at the life of Dinah. We looked at Levi and Simeon. We looked at Reuben. We looked at Judah. We looked at Joseph. But Jacob, their father, is still alive, and now the focus has come back to him. He grew up not too far from modern-day Israel. Modern-day Jerusalem. He grew up in Israel, but modern-day Jerusalem within Israel is where he grew up. He was right around that area. But he had to leave that area after the conflict with his brother Esau, his twin brother. He lived away from there for about 20 years before returning. But now again, he has to leave his homeland. He has to move to Egypt. Over and over, as we look at Jacob's life, we see a man who faced a lot of challenges. We see a man with a lot of blessings too. Do you remember how much livestock he ended up with when he was working for his father-in-law? Remember, his father-in-law was cheating him out of livestock, and finally he come up with a way to get a share of the livestock, not a percentage, but a share. He would get the colored livestock or the striped livestock or the spotted. And he ended up getting a lot of livestock. He ended up being very prosperous. He had a lot of blessings. But it wasn't an easy path to those blessings. There was a lot of adversity to get to those blessings. And it would be easy to focus on the adversity and miss the blessings. You can see that that's kind of what Jacob does. If Jacob can do that, you and I can end up doing that too. To forget to count our blessings, to focus on the adversity. Jacob's life is a reminder that it's not unusual for there to be trials. But also, his life is a reminder that we can trust God through those trials and even find God's blessings through those trials. Let's not forget, even the life of Jesus Christ himself was full of trials. Yet through him, the whole world was blessed as he went to the cross. The world has been blessed through Jacob as well. But not just the world blessed through Jacob. Jacob himself was blessed. As I mentioned, he ended up with a lot of livestock. He ended up with a lot of kids. Children are a blessing from the Lord, and Jacob had a big family. Like Jacob, our lives are filled with trials. But if we only focus on the trials, we can end up missing the blessings. Let's be reminded to count our blessings and not just to focus on the trials. Let's bow for a word of prayer, and then we'll dig into this passage. Dear Lord, I thank you that you've given us blessings beyond our wildest comprehension. I thank you that there are blessings for the future in heaven when we trust you. But I thank you that you've blessed us on this earth as well. Help us to notice those blessings and to not take them for granted. Help us to be thankful for them and to be thankful for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Jacob is moved to Egypt with his whole family. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is updated on the situation. Verse 1 of chapter 47. says, then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. I got to ask you, is this a blessing or is this a trial for Jacob? It's both. It's a trial because he had to leave his homeland to go to Egypt. He was sooner stayed home. He had to leave because there's a famine. That's the glass half empty. But the glass is half full. There are blessings here. He's not going to starve. He's going to have all his needs cared for. He's found his son who was lost. The family's back together again. There's all kinds of blessings and there's all kinds of trials. If you're an optimist, you could rejoice with Jacob. If you're a pessimist, you could grieve with Jacob. Jacob's life is a lot like ours. There's so many things in our life that we can look at and we can say, this is discouraging. And there are so many things we can look at the very same time. In fact, even the same circumstances, and say this is encouraging. And that's where Jacob is at. This is a time of discouragement for Jacob, but it's a time of rejoicing for Jacob. Oh, all those mixes of emotion. Yet it is truly a disruption in Jacob's life. I don't want to minimize the fact that this is hard for Jacob. And I don't want to minimize the fact that you and I are facing hard times in our lives as well. Things that we're not real happy about that we're having to go through. We find out that it's actually a blessing as Pharaoh gets to meet some of Joseph's brothers. But we can also look at it as a bit of a trial as he gets to meet those brothers. We'll see what I mean in a moment. Verses 2 through 3. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? So they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. Remember, the Egyptians detested shepherds. That occupation was an abomination to them. And yet that's what they tell Pharaoh that they do. The glass is half empty. They're shepherds. But the glass is half full. Remember, the fact that they were shepherds allowed them to live in the land of Goshen, allowed them to continue their lifestyle, and allowed them to be a cohesive family and to grow into a great nation. They tell Pharaoh about their occupation, just like Joseph had told them to do. By saying that they were shepherds, it allowed them to live in their own community. Thus, the thing that would have seemed like a curse, the fact that the Egyptians hated shepherds, or was an abomination to them. They detested them. They were bigoted against them. It ends up being a blessing. I don't know how many times I've shared the story of my pickup breaking down on the interstate, looking in the rearview mirror and seeing this haze of oil spraying out of my pickup, coming from the engine bay, and it was hitting the trailer behind that I was pulling. And so I pulled off the off ramp, and it was pumping oil out of my engine, quite literally. That was the trial. The blessing was I caught it in time before the oil level went down enough to damage the engine. The engine was fine. But the trial was there, I was stuck there. Blessing was I had a cell phone. The trial was I didn't have the part. Blessing was The part was at home, and my wife was able to bring it to me. The trial was I had to wait for her to get there. But the blessing was a man stopped as I was waiting and offered his help and said he lived just a mile and a half away. The blessings did stop. He also saw I had the little mini excavator in the back of the trailer. And he asked what I did. And I says, I do farm drainage. And he asked for my card. And I have done work for that man every year since. And I've done work for multiple of his neighbors. See, I'm not just a pastor, I'm a bivocational minister, so I have another job. And that blessing has helped finance this ministry so we could be here. But it was a trial. Having a breakdown is a trial, but there were so many blessings that came out of that trial. I'm so thankful that the pickup broke down that day. We don't realize why God allows trials in our life sometimes. That one was obvious, because we've seen the blessings through the years. Sometimes our trials takes years before we see the blessings. Sometimes we don't see them. But it wasn't the fact that God didn't care about me when he had that pickup breakdown that day. It was quite the opposite. He meant it for good. And God's caring for Jacob. He's caring for Jacob's sons. He's caring for Joseph and the rest of his brothers here in the midst of all of this. Not only is their request to live in Goshen granted, but Jacob's sons are offered important positions in Pharaoh's kingdom. Verses 5 and 6 says, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. The Egyptians don't even like those that are in charge of livestock. But Pharaoh says, I want to give that position to your brothers. Now, he's not offering to hire ranch hands. He's offering to hire foremen on the king's ranch. He's giving them management positions, not grunt positions. What a blessing. Not just management, upper management. Put them in charge of my livestock is what the king is saying. Jacob is definitely seeing blessings as he knows his sons will be taken care of and that he can pass his wealth on to them instead of losing it in the famine. Not only are Joseph's brothers offered positions as foremen on the king's ranch, they're able to grow their own ranches in Goshen at the same time. The best of the land is where they're able to settle. Land that's able to sustain livestock. He also has the blessing of seeing the rift between Joseph and his brothers healed. If Joseph was bitter against his brothers, he could have influenced Pharaoh to not be so kind. He could have told Pharaoh, don't offer them any positions. Make sure they're just barely getting by. But the opposite happens. Not only has Joseph introduced his brothers to Pharaoh and helped them settle in the best of the land, he also arranges for Pharaoh to meet with his father. Verse 7, Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Notice the king has all this stuff, all these resources, yet Jacob blesses Pharaoh. The one with his glass only half full is able to bless the one who has his glass overfilling. Pharaoh has all the power and wealth. It's Jacob who gives the blessing. To bless meant that Jacob was granting him peace and goodwill. You see, blessings are more than gold and land. They're more than grain and power. Jacob was granting him peace and goodwill. I cannot help but wonder if Jacob looked at Pharaoh and in the Jewish fashion said to him, Shalom. How many of you have ever heard a Jewish person say that? Shalom. Shalom means may you have peace and be filled with well-being. It is a true Hebrew Jewish blessing. Jacob, the father of the Jewish people, blessing for bringing a shalom to the king of Egypt. Jacob's life, however, had often lacked peace and well-being. Let's go back to when Joseph was just a kid. His dad liked his brother Esau better than he liked him. And he had conflict with his brother Esau. And Dad had to leave home because of it. His brother Esau wanted to kill him. He was cheated by his father-in-law when it came to marrying his wives. And then cheated out of the livestock as he's working for his father-in-law, or cheated out of wages, I would say. And then when he was given livestock, his father-in-law tried to cheat him out of those as well. Then his wives didn't get along with each other. He had trouble with his children. Dinah was raped. Simeon and Levi overreacted and caused there to be tension with him, with the people of that land. Reuben had an affair with his wife, with his father's wife, with Jacob's wife. Judah had a dalliance with his own daughter-in-law. And then Joseph was gone. Jacob thought he was dead. And then he finds out Simeon is a captive in Egypt. And the only way to free him is the only way to both free him and to get food, because now they're in the middle of a famine, which is yet another trial for Jacob. The only way to free his son Simeon is to send his youngest son Benjamin. Jacob's seen a lot of heartache. Been a lot of times the glass seen half full and even empty. Jacob had a lot of reason to be discouraged in his life. He had a lot of reason to rejoice. He had a lot of reason for blessing, but you can see he's got a lot of reason to be discouraged. And at this point in Jacob's life, he's feeling discouraged. Remember, he had to leave his homeland. The glass is half full. I got to go to Egypt now. I've been promised this land, and I got to leave it. He's feeling discouraged. He's looked back at his life and seen all these things that, yeah, this isn't what I wanted. Just notice what he says to Pharaoh. Or what Pharaoh says to him first. First Pharaoh said, verse 8, and Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Joseph said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained to the years of that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. Few and unpleasant. Jacob's just saying, I've had a lot of misery in my life. I've had a lot of trials. We've talked about some of those trials. Those were the big trials. Do you think those were the only trials Jacob had? How many of you think that he had a few more rough days other than the things I mentioned How many of you think that he had some of the same inconveniences that you had? How many of you think he ever had sick sheep? How many of you have ever raised sheep? You know the answer to that. Of course he had sick sheep. How many of those sick sheep do you think died? It's sick sheep's a dead sheep if you've ever raised sheep. If you got sheep, you're going to have trials. I don't know how many day-to-day trials he had. I don't know how many aches and pains he had. He's 130 years old. Do you think he ever had arthritis? I don't know. We don't have the answers to that. The point is, he's human. He's just being blunt. Got a lot of things to complain about. I think we can all say that. A lot of things to complain about. Few and unpleasant. Abraham, his grandfather, lived to be 175. Isaac, Jacob's father, lived to be 180. Jacob is only 130 at this time. He's already seen a lot of trials in his life. He'll live another 17 years after that. He'll only make it to 147, I believe it is. Quite a bit younger than Abraham and Isaac were. Yet with all the trial came blessings as well. Let's not forget, he was reconciled with Esau, his brother. He was able to return home after gaining much livestock in spite of being cheated. He is finally able to marry the love of his life, Rachel. By the way, she ends up dying. She died before they moved to Egypt. That was a big heartache in his life. Any of you who lost a spouse realize Jacob knows what that's like. I don't, but Jacob did. That's part of the reason for his answers. But he has so many blessings. His whole family's together. Those that are still alive are all together now. And Joseph isn't dead. Joseph's alive. And the rift between Joseph and his brothers has been healed. Not only have they survived the famine, they're being blessed even more, and they don't have to worry about starving during the famine. Their needs are going to be met. But that doesn't mean that the glass isn't only half full. That doesn't mean he doesn't have things to complain about. I'm not justifying his complaints. I'm just saying, he's like you. He's like me. You can focus on the things that aren't so good and miss the blessings. Jacob is telling Pharaoh the glass is half empty. But look how full it is. And what it is filled with are some of the best blessings you could ever imagine. Few people in the world are blessed as much as Jacob. Yet he too had trials. I mean, think of Jacob. When we read earlier about all the livestock he had, he comes to Esau. He's got so much livestock that he could share with Esau. He's got so much livestock that they can't dwell together. He wants to offer Esau a bunch of them. Esau says, no, I don't need them. That's how rich Jacob is. Let's not forget that. Then when you compare it to the wealth of Pharaoh, it doesn't look like he has much. Like I talked about T. Denny Sanford a little bit ago. Billionaire here in South Dakota. You have to compare him to Elon Musk. It doesn't look like he has very much. Yet he's got so much. And yet you look at what we have, and we have so much. Yeah, it ain't much compared to T. Denny Sanford, but we have so much. Those of us that have the least here have so much compared to the rest of the world. Just the fact that we live in the United States tells us we have so much. You look at the poverty level in the United States compared to the poverty level in other parts of this world. It blows my mind. Crystal lived in Peru for a year, and she's talked about it. That it's just, the comparison is, I can't get my mind around it. I haven't lived there. We have so many blessings, even with the little we have. Jacob has so many blessings. He's a wealthy man. He's got a huge family. His family's back together. Not only have they survived the famine, they continue to be blessed. Look at how good Jacob and his family now have it as we come to verses 11 and 12. So Jacob settled his fathers and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land of Ramses, Pharaoh ordered. And Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones. Joseph is the one who's in power there. He settled his father and his brothers in the best of the land. And he's there with them. His family is back together. Jacob has much to be thankful for. In the best of the land. Look again at verse 11. And gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land. Let's let Jacob's life remind us that when we focus on the bad parts of our life, we can so easily become discouraged. But we must be careful that such realities, and yes, they are realities. Our lives aren't perfect. But let's be careful that such realities do not cause us to forget the blessings of God. I do want to go off on a rabbit trail as I close, though. We look at the glasses. Are they half full? Or are they half empty? If we only focus on the fact that this is empty instead of full, we can become discouraged. But if we only focus on the fact that it's half full and don't recognize the trials of life, or ignore the trials totally, it can be dangerous. There's a trend that I really wasn't that aware of. I didn't realize it was a trend. I'd run into it a few times, but didn't realize how much momentum it was gaining. But it's called toxic positivity. It's the idea that people don't want to even acknowledge the fact that there's trials. And they don't want to talk about those trials. And they don't want to acknowledge the fact that their friends have trials. So if their friends are going through a difficult time and just want to talk about it, they'll say, don't even call me. Don't talk about it. Or, I'm going to cut you out of my life because you've got trials and I need to only focus on positive things in my life. I've run into a couple of people that have experienced that with their friends. And I found out it's gaining momentum. The reality is we have positive things in our life and we have negative things. We have trials and we have blessings. Now let's not focus just on our trials, because some people are toxically negative, while others are toxically positive. Both those things are toxic. Let's look at the realities of our life, that we have both positive things and negative things in our life. And let's look to God and look to others to help us deal with those. Don't be so toxically negative that people just don't want to be around you. But don't be so toxically positive that you never want to encourage and pray for people that are going through difficult trials. Both those things are part of the realities. Jesus did not ignore the trials that people were facing when they were on this earth. He looked at them. He saw them with health challenges. What did he do? He healed them. He saw them when they were hungry. What did he do? He fed them. He cared. He had compassion on the multitudes. He wasn't a toxically positive Messiah who ignored their trials. Let's look at the reality of our trials and not hide from them. Some of you have aches and pains. Some of you are discouraged by those aches and pains. It's part of our prayer requests. Don't hide them. Don't be so toxically positive that you pretend they don't exist. They do exist, and we need to encourage one another and love one another and have compassion on one another, while also reminding each other that, yeah, there are other things you can rejoice about. To not let that be the defining factor in your life, but not to ignore that factor. What did Jacob say? Evil have been my days. He's saying, I've had trials, I'm discouraged. We all have that. Read the Psalms sometimes. Look at King David. He was discouraged. He's a descendant of Jacob. I wonder if he got a little bit of that from Jacob. Where did we get it from? Adam? Even if you're not a descendant of Jacob, you go through that, I go through that. The psalmist had to write psalms to deal with it. But he turned to God for hope. Because you see that throughout the Psalms. You see his discouragement. You see that glass half empty. You see his trials expressed so clearly. And yet his thankfulness for God expressed so clearly as well. The Psalms are a great example of that balance. Let's try to find that balance in our lives. To not ignore the reality of trials, but to know that there's hope and blessing as well. I'm going to give you just a few moments to talk to the Lord, to pour out your heart to him about your discouragement, but also to thank him for your blessings, because you need to do both. And don't be afraid to do both. After you've had just a few moments to do that, Gerard, would you close us with a word of prayer?